Good morning. It is great to be here and to be with you. We looked last month, at another lesson in our once a month yearly theme, Examine Yourselves, and I've tried to mix these up and do some that were more general and some that are a little more specific. And last month we did kind of a general lesson looking at examining our attitudes individually. And then today, what we want to do is it's related to that and build on that, and it's this, what I'm calling examining my attitude toward truth. We talked last month about attitude in general, but think about this in terms of attitude toward truth. And what we're talking about here is a very prevalent, a very pervasive idea that truth is sort of fluid, malleable, moving, not objective, but more subjective. We sometimes refer to postmodernism. And there's a lot that could be said about that some of that gets into history and time periods. When does one end and one time period end, another begin? But we sometimes talk about postmodern thought, very closely related to relativism, the idea that things are relative, truth is relative. But I ran across, thinking about postmodernism, I was doing a little bit of research on that, and I think it was on just a little meme or something similar to that on Reddit. And I thought this was pretty interesting, a pretty good definition when you think about, of course, if some people say we're past the postmodern period, but again, I won't get into all that, but if we are in or even just outside of the postmodern period, then obviously that means before that would have been the modern period, or modernism we sometimes say, and before that, pre-modern or pre-modernism. But here's what I ran across, and I thought it sums it up quite well. It's very concise, and so take it for what it is. But somebody said pre-modernism could be summed up with the statement, the phrase, "We have the truth." Modernism could be summed up with the statement or the phrase, "We can find the truth." And then postmodernism could be summed up as, "There is no truth." There's a lot more that could be said, but it's pretty succinct, but that's a pretty good summation. But again, the foundation of postmodernism and that thinking is relativism. Just to give you if you want a dictionary definition, this is just from dictionary.com for relativism. It says any theory holding that criteria of judgment are relative, varying with individuals and their environments. Now, bear that in mind. In just a moment, we'll come back to that. If you want Merriam-Webster.com's definition, it says a view that ethical truths depend on the individuals and groups holding them. I say this, and we study this because it is so widespread. And we'll see that in just a moment in our first point. That's kind of what we're looking at. It is thinking that has infiltrated our society at large, en masse. It's not everybody. We need not think that it is, but it is a problem. I'll also add it's not new. We'll get into that again in the first point, but it is widespread and it is a problem. It's a problem because relativism is in direct opposition and it's incompatible with biblical truth, biblical absolutism, because the Bible's very clear, truth is absolute. And in fact, God says, Isaiah 5:20, "Woe unto them that call evil good and good evil, that put sweet for bitter and bitter for sweet, that put darkness for light and light for darkness." God says there is that which is evil, there is that which is good. And if you try to reverse that, woe unto you. And so it is a very important thing to examine what is my attitude toward truth? Because some folks have an attitude toward truth that they say, hey, look, and you do what you want to do. I'm not going to judge you. If it makes you happy to do that, that's fine. I knew a fellow one time that he was a Christian, had been astray, had been a drinker, and he decided he wanted to be faithful to the Lord. Said to one of his friends, hey, man, I quit drinking. Because he wanted to make sure that friend didn't invite him out drinking or whatever. And he said, hey, I just want you to know I quit drinking. And the guy first looked at him and he says, why would you do that? He said, well, I'm going back to church. I'm trying to do the right thing. And he kind of looked. And then he says, you know what? Good for you. You do what makes you happy, man. I'm happy for you. And that's relativism. Like, I don't have to do that. I don't need to do that. But yeah, if that makes you happy, good for you. And so, you see this so much in our society. People just say, well, I mean, I'm not a homosexual, but if somebody wants to practice that lifestyle and that's what makes them happy and that's their thing, hey, who am I to judge? That's the mentality, right? What's our attitude toward the truth of God's Word? And so again, that's kind of our first point. We're looking at this idea as truth relative. First point being the pervasiveness of relativism and postmodern thought. They're not new at all. Sometimes there's almost this arrogance that thinks that it's some kind of a new thing. But they're not really new at all. You can see it throughout Scripture. In fact, it goes back to the days of the judges at the very least. There's statements in Deuteronomy about not doing whatever you want to do or whatever's you see fit to do in your own eyes. But Judges 17:6 and 21:25, if you memorize one of these verses, you can already say, if you don't know any other scriptures, you memorize one of those and you can double it easily because they say the exact same thing. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Whatever was right in his own eyes, that's what they did. And so you see it in the days of the judges. You see it in the days of the divided kingdom. Psalm 81, 11 and 12. It says, my people would not hearken to my voice. God is speaking through the psalmist. My people would not hearken to my voice, and Israel would none of me. So I gave them up unto their own heart's lust, and they walked in their own counsels. We also see it in New Testament times. John 18, 37 and 38, Jesus' own trial, if you want to call it that. It's kind of a farce of a trial. But he's on trial before Pilate, and Pilate asks a question in verse 37, art thou a king then? So you're a king. This is right on the heels of Jesus saying, my kingdom's not of this world. Oh, so you're a king then? Jesus says, thou sayest that I am a king. To this end was I born, and for this cause came I into this world, that I should bear witness unto the truth. Everyone that is of the truth heareth my voice. And you know where I'm going with this. You know Pilate's response. He says, what is truth? Now, this is not like you're standing around, you're talking to some friends, and they're telling you something, and maybe one friend says this is what happened, and the other one says something that's a little bit different, and so you're like, well, guys, I'm a little bit confused. So what's the truth here? You're trying to find out the truth. You're trying to find information. That's not what Pilate's doing. This is a scoffing. In fact, you can almost picture Pilate sort of, maybe he rolls his eyes and goes, what is truth? Jesus says, everyone who's of the truth hears my voice. Please, what is truth? As if to say, who could even know what truth is? It's so relative, it's so moving and fluid. That's not what Jesus taught, is it? In fact, Paul will talk about in Ephesians 4:14, not being children, tossed to and fro and carried about with every wind of doctrine by the sleight of men and cunning craftiness whereby they lie in wait to deceive. Colossians 2:23, he'll talk about a show of wisdom in, the King James has will worship. New King James says self-imposed religion. Just doing whatever I feel like. It is very pervasive. These things aren't new, but make no mistake, they are incredibly widespread. Postmodern thought and its foundation, relativism. I'll give you just a couple of illustrations here that I think show this. Alan Bloom, a fellow named Alan Bloom in 1987 wrote this book called The Closing of the American Mind. He's not a religious writer. He's an educator, higher education. But listen to what he says. I mean, this is one of those that I read a couple of quotes from this book, and I'm just sort of like, wow, this is frightening. Just as kind of a summation, it's a critique of the state of higher education in America. This is in 1987, so it's been what? 30? I'm looking at you, Bob. 37? 30-something years ago. How about that? But it's a critique of higher education in America, arguing that universities have abandoned the pursuit of intellectual rigor in favor of relativism and political correctness. He contends that this shift in higher education has led to a decline in critical thinking, a loss of commitment to the classical liberal education that he believes is essential for fostering a well-rounded, engaged citizen. He laments the abandonment of timeless philosophical and ethical questions in favor of more contemporary, less challenging topics, suggesting that this trend undermines the intellectual and moral development of students. And so his work is a call to return to a more rigorous and traditional approach to education. I asked ChatGPT for just a quick summary, and that's what I got out of the book, if you want just kind of a quick summation. But here's a quote from the book from Bloom himself. "There is one thing a professor can be absolutely certain of. Almost every student entering the university believes, or says he believes, that truth is relative. If this belief is put to the test, one can count on the student's reaction. They will be uncomprehending. That anyone should regard the proposition as not self-evident astonishes them, as though he were calling into question 2 + 2 = 4. These are things you don't think about. The students' backgrounds are as various as America can provide. Some are religious, some are atheists, some are to the left, some to the right. Some intend to be scientists, some humanists or professionals or businessmen. Some are poor, some are rich. They're unified only in their relativism and in their allegiance to equality. And the two are related in a moral intention. The relativity of truth is not a theoretical insight, but a moral postulate. In other words, a moral starting assumption. The condition of a free society, or so they see it. They have all been equipped, listen to this, they have all been equipped with this framework early on, and it is the modern replacement for the inalienable natural rights that used to be the traditional American grounds for a free society. He also writes, the danger they have been taught to fear from absolutism is not error, but intolerance. Relativism is necessary to openness, and this is the virtue, the only virtue, which all, listen to it, which all primary education for more than 50 years has dedicated itself to inculcating. Openness and the relativism that makes it the only plausible stance in the face of various claims to truth and various ways of life and kinds of human beings is the great insight of our times. Hear what he says here. This is not his position. He's saying this is what students are coming into the universities, coming in believing. The true believer is the real danger. We sometimes say, boy, we're worried about our children. They go off to university and sometimes they hear things and they get indoctrinated with things, and we're worried about losing our children when they go off to university. Hey, it's happening a lot sooner than that. There's things that are being indoctrinated very early on, and one of them is this idea that, well, is truth really? Can you imagine that as a math teacher, Bob? I mean, the idea that truth could somehow be fluid and somebody could come up and, take a basic math test, 2 + 2 is 3, and, hey, look, 4, 2 + 2 = 4, that's your truth. But don't judge my truth. That's outlandish. And people understand that. Even a lot of modernists or postmodernists and relativists understand that when it comes to math, but not some of these other matters. And so understand, he's saying relatively or virtually every student, incoming student, believes in some form of relativism, to some extent in relativism. And he's saying it's being inculcated, indoctrinated at a very young age, even as early as primary education. That's not to say it's happening everywhere, but it's just to say, understand, it is widespread. We got our work cut out for us. There's another thing I want to mention to you, as by way of illustration. 2001 Barna Research Group, they did this poll on relativism, and it's basically asking the question, and there was, there's several notes if you go and you read the actual report, but they're kind of saying, well, after 9/11, people began to believe more in absolute truth, but there's still a really concerning lack of belief in absolute objective truth. I'll go ahead and tell you this. I heard Aaron Gallagher from GBN. I heard him speak yesterday, and he actually, in his lesson, brought out a 2023 Barna survey. That's last year. Even I can do that. That's just 1 year ago. And I'm telling you, it's not gotten better. It's gotten far worse. I'd asked him for it, and I think he forgot me. I didn't get the email or a text or anything from him. I think it slipped his mind. But maybe at some point I can bring that and let you hear some of that, because if these numbers sound concerning, you should have heard the numbers he was mentioning. I won't go through all of these. I know statistics can easily become just kind of, white noise. But among adults, 64% to 22%. Let me reword that. That's almost 3 to 1. Almost 3 to 1 said truth is always relative to a person or a situation. That's astounding. 3 to 1. And it's gotten worse, a lot worse. Among teenagers, 83% who responded believed in relativism. 83% of teenagers. You know how many said truth is absolute among the teenagers? 6%. Shocking. Another thing that stood out to me is among those who claim to be, their term, born-again Christians. I know that's redundant. If you're a Christian, you've been born again. And if you're born again, scripturally, you're a Christian. But this is a term that they use. So only 32% of them believed in moral absolutes. What? The people that claim to be Christians, they're going to say, oh yeah, I believe in absolute truth. It's in the Bible. Nope. 32%. It's not even a third. Of the teens who claim to be Christians, 9%. They asked another question, basically saying, when you're faced with a moral or ethical choice, which one of the following best describes how you yourself decide what to do? There were a lot of different answers. I won't give you all those just for time's sake and to not bore you to death. But, again, Christians are going to say, I'm faced with a moral decision. I'm going to make my decision based on the Bible, right? 26%. That's not everybody surveyed. That's the ones who claim to be Christians. 26% said, I'm faced with a moral decision. I make it based on the teachings of the Bible. 26%. I can't even comprehend that. And it's gotten worse. 13% overall survey respondents. 12% of those claiming to be teens said they make decisions according to the Bible. Among those who claim to be Christians, here's one of the responses. I make my decision based on whatever feels right or comfortable in the situation. You know how many people said that? 24%. That's not just everybody. That's among those claiming to be Christians. I make a moral decision based on what feels right, what feels comfortable at the time. Or another one, whatever produces the most positive outcome for them, 9%. Just shocking. It's just hard to believe that many people say that, but it's there. And again, when you look at the updated survey from last year, it wasn't the exact same questions, but very similar, dealing with absolute truth or not. And it's just, it's It's mind-boggling. And we need to be aware of that. It's very, very widespread. We have our work cut out for us. I mentioned this illustration, I don't know, a Wednesday night or two ago, where if you want a good illustration, it's not original with me, of what relativism is. If you've ever been at a stoplight and you got to kind of get that sensation like you're starting to move, you're rolling forward or rolling backward. And sometimes, it's just, I don't know, I can't explain that, but you get that sensation. And, if you're in the driver's seat, you may just sort of make sure you got your foot on the gas. I mean, not the gas. That would be bad. On the brake. You may press a little harder on the brake to make sure I'm not actually moving. But what if you're in the passenger seat or you're in the back seat and you get that sensation and you're kind of like, well, what's going on? You may look and see a tree or a building. Might even be just a street sign, a stop sign, some kind of sign post. And that's still, and you go, okay. And that gives you a point of reference, right? Now, relativism is picture being at that stoplight. You get that sensation you're moving. You look out, the trees are moving. The buildings are moving. The signpost, the fence post, whatever. Everything is moving and it's fluid and there's no point of reference. That's relativism. There is no point of reference by which you can determine anything, right, wrong, whatever. And that's how it's so pervasive. Let's talk about some relatives of relativism. You see these different forms of relativism. And again, you'll recognize many of these, no doubt. One is, and these first two are probably the most popular, religious relativism. We sometimes say pluralism. In other words, nobody can claim to be the truth. That's what they would say. Nobody can claim to be the truth. In fact, that was part of Bloom's quote, if I could find it in the midst of this. The true believer is the real danger. Why? Well, because he actually believes he has the truth. I've had people say that to me before. Chad, you just think you're so right, don't you? And I was like, my response to that was, and I'm trying to keep things like, sort of light because I'm not trying to get into a big fight or argument with somebody. But I said, what kind of statement is that? Of course I think I'm right. You think you're right. What would you think of me if I stood in the pulpit and say, hey, look, y'all, I don't believe this. I don't think this is even true. But let me tell you about it and encourage you at the end of the service to obey it. That would be, that would just be dumb. Illogical. Well, of course I think I'm right. That doesn't mean I think I'm right and I think I cannot possibly be wrong. But yes, I think I'm right, and I'm not just basing that on supposition. I'm going to study it out. But they say nobody can claim to have the truth. Well, I think I read where somebody claimed to be the truth, the way, the life. And he said, no man comes unto the Father but by me. John 14:6. That was Jesus, of course. But they say nobody can claim to be the truth. All roads lead to God, they would say. The only wrong thing to these people of this mindset is to say that there is but one way. You could say there are 50,000 ways to heaven, to the Father. And they're okay with that. Even those that deny Jesus. But the one person you got to beware of, remember the quote? He says, the true believer is the real threat. Boy, I'm telling you, the one person you got to watch out for, according to these folks, is that guy that thinks there's just one way. Isn't that amazing? And I'll tell you what's ironic with this is you can read some denominational folk, I'm talking in the religious world, religious denominations, and they see this when it comes to Hinduism, Islam, and things like that, and they'll say, oh, all roads do not lead to God, and we got to stand firm on the message of the Bible. Jesus is the way, the truth, the life. And all the while they say, now, but leave these people alone that claim to be Christians. You don't need to be saying that there's just one church and all that. And yet, what does the Bible say? It's just as clear as day. And they can see it when it comes to world religions, but they just don't see it or won't see it many times when it comes to sectarianism within the so-called Christian world. But that's religious relativism, or again, we sometimes say pluralism. But another is moral relativism. This is just humanism. Moral relativism. No moral absolutes, no objective standard. Might very well be the most pervasive kind of relativism today. Picture a child, maybe a child home from school and engaging in immorality. And maybe mom and dad are trying to talk to them about it and say, hey, this isn't right. Maybe it's even a child with religious upbringing. Maybe even a child that's obeyed the gospel. And they might say something like, now look, Mom, Dad, that's your morality. That's your generation's morality. But that's not mine. Things are different now. And that's okay. But you see, it's not okay. That's moral relativism. Then there is cultural relativism. We sometimes say multiculturalism. This is the idea that right and wrong differs by culture. Now listen, there's a good sense of this, multiculturalism. Christians come from all different cultures, and there's no such thing as an American Christian in the sense of that's the right way to be or whatever. And we sometimes fall into that trap, and we want to superimpose American Christianity on other places and other countries and other cultures. But Christians are from all different cultures, ethnicities. And you know, I've told you before, in Costa Rica, there's not a congregation, unless things have changed in the last year or so, there's not a single congregation that has a Sunday evening service. And that's not sinful. That's how they do it. They have a lot of people that come from a long ways off. They have to use public transportation. They have to pay for the bus. They have to ride sometimes multiple hours to get there. So they have a protracted morning worship. That's a culture thing. That's neither here nor there as far as it's not right, it's not wrong. But what we're dealing with are matters of right and wrong. And that's when it becomes a bad thing, such as legalized euthanasia. There are places, countries where it's legalized, just part of their culture. And somebody might say, hey, who are you to judge their culture? In China, they have had before, I don't know if it's, I think they've eased up on it some because of some backlash, but they've at least in times past, they've had a strict one-child policy. I've been told before that even if, and I don't know, I think sometimes it gets denied, but there are others who say, oh, it definitely has happened, and some say it still happens, of forced abortions. If a couple has a child and the woman is pregnant and it's a daughter, they say forced abortion. But whether that's still happening or not, it could happen in the culture, and somebody might say, well, that's just their culture. Leave them alone. You know, there are cultures where the women don't wear any clothing from the waist up. So I say, well, it's just their culture. Who are you to judge that? That's cultural relativism. Next would be historical relativism. We sometimes use the term deconstructionism. This really, bottom line is, it attempts to rewrite history. Sees history as these constructs that are interpreted by certain cultures, certain people. Give you another little tidbit here from Bloom's book. He says, after he says the true believer is the real danger, listen to this. The study of history and of culture teaches that all the world was mad in the past. This is not his position. He's saying this is what is being taught often today. The study of history and of culture teaches that all the world was mad in the past. Men always thought they were right. And that led to wars, persecutions, slavery, xenophobia, xenophobia being fear of strangers, racism, and chauvinism. Oh, listen to this. This is so powerful and true. The point is not to correct the mistakes and be really right. Rather, it is not to think you are right at all. They don't care about the truth. They don't care about correcting mistakes. They'll go on and on about, oh, history, war has been started over this or that. People thought they knew everything. It's not about correcting and being right. It's about just don't say you're right. Isn't it crazy? An example I thought of was Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code from the early 2000s, I think. Just made up history. He finally, when he got pushed on it, admitted it's just fiction. But there are bookstores, they put it in the historical section and sell it as if it's history. There are bookstores didn't even have it in the fiction section. It just made up history. Rewriting history. We've seen a lot of that just in the last few years, haven't we? And then there's scientific relativism. We might say scientism. Deciding what somebody wants to believe and then trying to use science, so-called, to prove it. This often delves into philosophy, into theology, all in the name of science. Boy, we could go on and on about that, and we've studied that many times before in apologetics. But here's a statement from Carl Sagan, a renowned atheist, former atheist. He's dead now, so I don't say that to be disrespectful, but I promise you there are no atheists beyond this life. But he made this statement: the cosmos is all there is, was, or ever will be. Now, folks, I heard fellows say that that's not a scientific statement, that's a doxology. I mean, we could stand and sing at the end of science class and exit class to that if we wanted to just worship science, so-called. It's just made-up science. It's not even a scientific statement. Scientific relativism. There's aesthetic relativism. You know the saying, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Well, some things, whoever beholding it is beholding something rough. But, in a good way, this recognizes differing tastes, views, opinions. What's beautiful to you may not be so beautiful to somebody else. What is your favorite food may be to somebody else disgusting. So there's a good sense to this, just like multiculturalism. But in a bad way, you have things that are put all over the place, sinful things, such as pornographic images and such. And people say, well, it's just art. It's just art, man. You can't judge that. Beauty's in the eye of the beholder. Well, some things cross the line into immoral, sinful things. And then there's legal relativism. This is the idea there's no God, there are no morals to regulate a nation's culture, a nation's or a culture's laws. And it says man makes his own laws, any country, any culture, independent of any higher authority. And yet, look, we don't really believe that. Well, most people don't really believe that. Because, after World War II, there were trials, Nuremberg trials. And those men were put on trial for crimes against humanity. They weren't crimes against the United States of America. Why? Well, because those people weren't amenable to the laws of the United States of America. They were Germans and other countries as well, but mostly Germans. They weren't put on trial for crimes against Germany because they were the law. They made the laws. Oh, but are they not subject to a higher authority? The world said yes. And so, well, what's our crime? Tell us our crime. We didn't break any laws in our country. Oh, your crimes were crimes against humanity. And so those are some very close relatives of relativism. You see what I did there? Let's talk next about a response to relativism. How do we respond to this? What's the believers', the Christians' response? If we're going to be right with God, if we're going to have hope beyond this life, what's our response to relativism? Well, we got to respond logically. There are three foundational laws of logic that utterly destroy relativism. One is the law of identity. It's crucial for us to know what or who is being considered. This law of identity says A is equal to A. That seems self-evident, right? But it is critical because you need to know who's being talked about. We might have somebody up here and say, John is John. Well, thank you, Chad. Duh. But that's important because we might need to specify further and say John Doe or John Smith is John Smith. That distinguishes him from somebody else in the audience that might be named John. But we could even go further than that because, John and Smith are two common names. And so, I don't know, probably hundreds, maybe thousands, even just in our country. So you got to specify who, what you're talking about. That's the law of identity. And so it is very important. There's a law of non-contradiction. This is, in logic, you would say A is not non-A. Well, again, we probably are tempted to kind of go, yeah, duh. A is not non-A. But hear me out. Statements cannot be true, both be true, at the same time and in the same sense. Right? I think we understand that. You can't have two statements that are true, both true, at the same time and in the same sense. For instance, you want a common example? Homosexuality is sinful behavior. Homosexuality is acceptable behavior. Those are contradictory statements. One of them is wrong. It cannot be both. That's the law of non-contradiction. And, it's easy for us a lot of times to nod and say, oh, yeah, absolutely. But we could go even to things like, fornication. Illicit sexual behavior is sinful. Fornication or illicit sexual behavior is acceptable. Can't be both. And so you see that law of non-contradiction. And that's important. Don't confuse this, by the way, with words that are used in a different sense or of a different time period. I might say, John Smith, our illustration that we used just a moment ago, might say John Smith is rich. And somebody may say, oh, no, you've identified him, and I know him, and he's broke as a joke. But might I be talking about he's rich in blessings, he's got a great family? I might say, he's a Christian, and so he's richly blessed spiritually. Somebody might say, well, that's not true either. He's not even a Christian. So maybe it's here's the guy that you say he's rich. And somebody says, no, he's not rich in that sense. But it could be a different time period. You see, maybe sometimes somebody who once was rich, now they've lost everything and they're poor. Maybe they were poor and they worked hard, or maybe they got a big inheritance. I don't know. And now they're rich. On and on we go. So don't confuse different time periods, different senses of the word. Somebody might say, that's cool. And they might mean it's cold, frigid to the touch, or they might mean, I like it a lot. Different words used different ways. Then there's the law of the excluded middle. A is either A or non-A at a given time. And what we mean by that is, well, Jesus is either God or he's not God, non-God. The Bible is inspired or it is non-inspired. There's no middle ground. And this morning you're a Christian, a child of God, or you're a non-Christian. I can't say, well, I'm kind of a Christian. I'm almost a Christian, probably halfway. There's no middle ground. I either am or I'm not. I'm following Christ or I'm not. So logic, basic laws of logic. And then there's a biblical response, and that is just to understand truth derives from God. The Lord is the true God, Jeremiah 10:10. He says, I, the Lord, speak righteousness. I declare things that are right, Isaiah 45:19. Psalm 19:8 says, the statutes of the Lord are right. Rejoice in the heart. In fact, in Psalm 12:6, he says, the words of the Lord are pure words, as silver tried in a furnace of earth, purified 7 times. And Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. Truth emanates from God, the Godhead. And second, truth is revealed in the inspired Word of God. If you continue in my word, then are you my disciples indeed, and you shall know the truth, Jesus says, and the truth shall make you free. John 8:31 and 32. Sanctify them through thy truth. Thy word is truth. God's word is truth. John 17:17. So it's revealed in the inspired Word of God, and kind of going with that, the gospel of Christ is truth. 3 times, John 14:17, John 15:26, John 16:13, Jesus speaking to his apostles, and he calls the Holy Spirit the Spirit of truth. Galatians 2:14, Colossians 1:5, he calls the gospel the truth, or referring to the gospel, he says the truth of the gospel. So we need to respond biblically. There's a logical response, and it works hand in hand with the biblical response to understand there is no such thing as your truth, my truth, the world's truth, someone else's truth. Folks, there is just truth. There's truth and there's error. We can know it, and it's not moving, it's not fluid, it is fixed. Forever, O Lord, thy word is settled in heaven. So again, going back to that law of the excluded middle, this morning, I'm either God's child, I'm either a Christian, or I'm not. And so are you a child of God this morning? If you're not, that's why we extend heaven's invitation. If as a child of God I've wandered away and I'm not where I need to be, maybe I've fallen into this idea that truth can be just relative and I can have my truth and somebody else have theirs and somebody else have theirs. Truth is truth is truth. And listen, this relativist mindset, it enslaves. It promises freedom, but it enslaves us. Jesus says, whoever is a servant of sin, whoever commits sin is the servant of sin. He says the truth will make you free. John 8:32-34. And listen to what he says in verse 36. If the Son therefore make you free, then are you free indeed. Would you be free? Come while we stand and sing to encourage you.